right. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today is the 12th of May. My gosh, 2021. I'm Roy Potter. And David Knight, of course, I always want everybody to see him in the morning. He's backed off the 3 hour program and gone to a 2 hour program. So now I have this little window here that I can throw this up for your information and for your perusal. Hello, everyone, as you come in, and these are subjects that are probably going to disturb some people for a lot of reasons. But given the circumstances that we find ourselves today with this assault on humankind, on the male and female relationship, on children, the big push to these new how many different supposed sexes do they have now, and the drag queen story times, and I mean, we're even putting up the LGBTQ flag at our embassies, and they're being flown at other places around the world. Uh, you know how I addressed this in the past, and I don't want to go too far there. Just to tell you that that is the reason why I'm doing this. Okay, because it is very important that we understand the situation as it's developing and what they're trying to do to us. So I've had several questions over the years. I haven't seen this one poster in a while on YouTube or Twitter. I don't know if he's changed his name or that he's just not coming back because I just wouldn't budge on this issue. But he used to come back and he used to say that women are poison, that marriage is bad, that we're all going to be single, we're all going to be neither male nor female. He was one of those that went along with that whole thing, not realizing that he was going along with the Luciferian doctrine, or else he just figured that because Christ said something, that he had figured it out, and that's what he was going to do. Kind of like Origen did. I've talked about it before. Origen read that statement by Jesus, where he says, there are those who make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. And Origen went, oh, I guess I need to castrate myself. There's a question about whether he really did that or not, and I'm going to partially explain that here this morning in the little time that I have. So basically, the reason why I'm doing this is because there is this total onslaught on humanity right now. I was very happy to see Dr. Rand Paul. Good morning, Mrs. Cat. How you doing? I was very happy to see Rand Paul confront Fauci yesterday, or the day before, I guess it was. I was a little disappointed during the hearing because he didn't actually talk about the actual origins of this pandemic, but scandemic, let's call it what it is, pandemic, scandemic. Hopefully I don't get thrown off for that. This one's not that important though, so whatever. Uh, but he did come out later and explain the problem with North Carolina and with the U.S. being intimately involved, at least members of the U.S. government being intimately involved in the creation of this entire thing. And shame on Trump. Everybody wants to excuse him. He didn't know. He didn't know. Well, then he's a stupid ass, okay? He's just a stupid ass, but he's not. I noticed this morning and I retweeted it out where Trump was there with his hands on the Palantir along with the king of Saudi Arabia and another president of another Arab country. I don't remember which one it was. I think it was Egypt. All of that was evil. It had to do with submitting themselves to Lucifer's power. That's what it was about. It was transferring their worldly kingdoms to Lucifer. Remember the story of Satan taking Jesus up to the hilltop, and I brought this up the other day, and he says, all these kingdoms I will give you if you will worship me. Well, of course, the story is that Jesus said, no, go away, forget it, because he already knew he already had it. That was his inheritance. It was already his, like it is ours, right? But these world leaders went and basically submitted their power to this evil entity that Palantir is definitely a part of, and that glowing globe is what that symbolized, in case you didn't know. So the world leaders gave over their power to this central evil power, and they're all working for that. And there are some doing it more than others. And my contention still is, and we've seen that Trump is still in the limelight, He's not going. He's interfering as much as people were complaining that Obama was. He's doing the same thing. So it's all about coming after us, the people. So at any rate, with that little introduction, that's the reason why I've decided to do this. I did get some comments again about some of my explanations in DMs and in other people who just contact me, and so hence I'm doing this. So let's get right into it. We've only got about 20 minutes to a half an hour, and then other things. Anyway, just keep track of what's going on in the world. The fighting in Israel, the tanking of our economy, which continues. The things about the forced medical procedures, which are above and beyond, of course, Nuremberg crimes. And yet all the governments are submitting that. Again, I go back to all of them, especially Trump and those other guys laying their hands on that Palantir, transferring their authority to that object, to that AI, to that entity. We have that going on. We have the situation, of course, with the shortages, different shortages that are going on, the threatening of war, the ongoing violence from the left, the twisting of truth, Biden off in some other world, being guided by an earpiece on what to say. You get the idea. It's all a mess, and it's all coming down. Okay, so we have to take an active part. That was another thing a person wrote me this morning, I guess it was this morning on Twitter, saying, I'm not listening to you guys anymore because you guys who are the experts aren't doing anything. And I said, what do you mean we're not doing anything? Of course we're doing stuff, but we're not stupid either, okay? We're doing this in the best way that we can at this point right now. We're not going to commit a Gettysburg, okay? We're going to, the Pickett's charge thing, we're not going to do that. So anyway, I asked him what he was doing, and he says, well, I'm not an expert with a platform. Well, okay, then let leave it to the experts. We know what we're doing, okay? There's only so much you can do. All right, so anyway, I've had all these questions, and here we are. So what about Jesus saying there are those who make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake? What is that about? That's this line right here. What was he talking about? What was going on in the first century where he would say something like that? A lot of Christians have said, well, that means celibacy. The priest becomes celibate. It's better not to take a wife, kind of like what I was saying the other day, where Paul says, if a woman doesn't have a husband, don't look for a husband. If a man doesn't have a wife, don't look for a wife. But I don't get a command from the Lord. I just look at it that way. Well, as I've explained, he was in this controversy, this argument with James, who was the head of the Jerusalem community, of course, which I've explained on several videos. And James, of course, was saying if anybody is going to join us, then they're going to have to be circumcised. That was one of the issues, and that's become a big thing in Christianity. No, Christians don't have to be circumcised. No this, no that. The point is, as I made the other day, that was James's house. That was God's house. That they understood it at that time. And for them to allow people in, they had to abide by certain rules of the house. And if they weren't willing to abide by those rules of the house, they couldn't come in, even if Paul insisted that they do. Okay? Well, Paul didn't have any right to invite people into the house once he's been told they're not welcome. However you feel about it doesn't matter. That was the issue. One of those things was circumcision. Of course, the other thing I've talked about is not eating things sacrificed to idols, not eating carrion. That's things that are already dead of themselves or whatever. Fornication, primarily meaning no sexual relationships outside of Israel. And there were even some restrictions on priests who they could marry, Levite priests, which there was a question of who that was at that time. But the Levites under James, he even gave them a further thing. And again, I had some problems with James. He went even further and said the Levites can't marry other Israelites. Well, I think the big issue is who were those people, I think is the point at that time. How are they going to identify them? But regardless, those were the rules of the house, okay? And Paul wasn't willing to do that. He was saying that no, Jesus told him that it was okay to do that. Well, James knew Jesus personally. Paul didn't. I'm not refuting the concept of revelation, but as I pointed out, it's my historical judgment. I mean, you can believe Pauline letters and epistles and all that Pauline Christianity if you want. All I'm saying is historically there's a problem. Okay, so let's get back to the question of celibacy and eunuchs in Parousia, or Parousia, as some would say. We'll talk about Parousia in a few minutes. They're not linked. I just threw all the topics I'm going to cover up here real quick. Celibacy was never an issue in Israel's kingdoms, in God's commandments. Never. As a matter of fact, quite the opposite. Man and woman were to come together and multiply and replenish the earth. The first reason for a man and woman to come together, as Genesis explains, is for companionship. Then the fruit of that companionship is the multiplying and replenishing the earth. The number one reason was companionship. Number two was progeny. Okay, both important, but in that order. God looked at the union between the man and the woman as the most important thing, and then the children issue from that. Now, in the Old Testament days, women, they had this situation where if a woman couldn't have children, the husband could divorce them. Even though the husband may have been responsible, as we know today, sometimes they didn't function well either, but they always blamed it on the woman. Regardless, the point is that if a woman couldn't have children, she would constantly pray to God to take away her reproach. In other words, to give her children. That was the big thing, because they understood that, well, they already had the companionship. Is this companionship bad? Is that why God isn't giving us children? You see how they were thinking? Things like that. So they considered it a curse not to have children. How different are we today? We kill our children today. Horrible. So at any rate, with that background, there was no celibacy in the Old Testament. I'm not saying there weren't people that didn't get married. Of course, that happened just in a matter of course of life. But it wasn't something that was expected, and it certainly wasn't commanded in any way, shape, or form. Now we go to the New Testament. And I've explained before why James, in particular, if you read Josephus, and if you read the Talmud even, and if you read the Dead Sea Scrolls, the work of Robert Eisenman and others, you'll see that James and many members of the Jerusalem church, the Jerusalem community, who were actually there in Qumran and the Dead Sea, had taken Nazirite vows. And sometimes in those Nazirite vows, not all the time, but they're about purity. For instance, you don't cut your hair, you don't drink impure liquids, you don't eat unclean foods, you stay away from women when they're menstruating, and you go through a period of cleanliness and all that. And the idea was to stay like a mobile holy of holies, so that they could have communion with the holy host of God. God and his holy armies, his host. So that was the reason, because they anticipated any day that there would be a war against the Kittim, and they were going along with Leviticus, as I've explained, where it says, I've explained this many times, if a man marries himself a wife, he cannot go into war for 1 whole year, at least, because he has to do the duties of a husband. He has to be there to make his wife happy, do the marital thing, do the marital thing. All right. And so all of those people understood that. And so between the idea that they wanted things to be holy so that they could fight this war against Rome, and so that they could dedicate themselves to that and have these, like I say, these holy angels come in, that was the reason why they did that. It wasn't a command of celibacy, not by any way, shape, or form. As a matter of fact, in James's things to the community at large, he never says to be celibate. What he says is don't commit fornication. They did have marriage rules, for instance. Not all the Essenes were unmarried. Matter of fact, most of them were married. And there were these different sects, as Hippolytus explains later. But at any rate, the marriage, when they did come together, it was under very specific circumstances. Again, it wasn't promiscuity, for instance. They had rules about divorce. They had rules about if a wife dies or a husband dies, what happens in a situation like that. And especially about incest. Okay, there were things like that. That's what they were talking about, and marrying foreigners. That's what the whole thing about sleeping with women in their periods wasn't just because of what Leviticus said. It was also because that was a pagan practice. That if you're with a woman who's in her period, then the chances are you've married or had you've had um, these relations with a woman who's not an Israelite, who's not a Jew. So therefore, that was the real concept of fornication, that you're marrying strange wives, just like Solomon did and got in trouble for it. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about what this eunuch thing was really about. Paul talks about a historical situation that apparently did happen, but he changed the storyline a little bit, and so did Luke, um, about this queen from Ethiopia whose eunuch heard them reading the scriptures and then wanted to be baptized, and they call him a eunuch. Okay, well, why do they call this? Why do they call these people eunuchs? Why did Jesus say those who are eunuchs, who make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake? Well, it revolves around what the Romans did to counter this. They knew that their enemies were those who practiced circumcision, be they freeborn, regular born Jews, or whether they were converts like Queen Helen of Adiabene's two boys, Monobazus and Kennedeus, I think is his name. Those two who converted into the Jerusalem community very much. I mean, Helen went along with the conversion, but she didn't like the circumcision too much. Okay, but they had themselves circumcised. That's what Jesus was talking about, is when they come into his community, Jesus's community, and into the James community, because James took over after Jesus. The requirement was that they would circumcise themselves, and the Romans considered circumcision to be castration. The same that they would do to eunuchs in the king's court when they would castrate those eunuchs so that they couldn't impregnate the queens and the nobles. That did happen, but that's not what was going on with the Jamesian community. The Romans looked on it as castration, and they called it that. Now, if you read my book, The Crimson Thread, there are several stories in there about that very thing, how the Romans looked at it as becoming a eunuch, even though the Jews were just going to force them to cut their foreskin off. But that's what it was about. And during the time of Hadrian, the Emperor Hadrian, during the Bar Kokhba rebellion, one of the things they did was the Romans, because they wanted to make sure that they could identify these Christians, these really zealot Jews is what they were. That's how they were looked at, and rightly so. As if you've been following me, you'll understand that. They came up with this thing called the Lex Cornelia de Sicarius. And basically, it's a law that was put in by a guy by the name of Cornelia against or for the people that were committing this circumcision or mutilating their male member. That's what it was about. And why? Because if they did that, they were submitting not to the emperor and their gods, but they were submitting to not even Jesus. They were submitting to the Jamesian community, the Zealots, the Messianic movement, etc. That's what it was really about. And it got even worse. There were people in even the Jamesian community. They were known as Sicarii, and they carried on over many years later. I'll tell you about one instance that happened later during the destruction of the library at Alexandria. But what some of these really fanatic Jews turned Messianic movement, Jamesian associated groups, Jesus associated groups, frankly. Again, he wasn't crucified because he was teaching the Beatitudes. He was a political insurrectionist and was recognized such, not just because he taught about another God. The Romans didn't care about that. Romans assimilated other gods all the time. That wasn't the issue. That's a Christian apologetic position. But at any rate, so what happened was these Jewish people, these Jewish zealots, these militants, these guerrillas, when they'd find, especially Romans, talking about the Torah, they would forcefully go attack them, haul down their pants, and they had a special knife. It wasn't. There's a question as to whether or not it was the sicker at that point. I don't think so. They had a particular stone type of knife that they used for circumcision in those days, and they would forcibly circumcise the Romans. Well, a lot of obviously the Romans didn't take kindly to that, and it was one of the reasons for the war that started, was that animosity that arose, because the Romans considered that they had just been mutilated, they had just been castrated. That's how they looked at it. Well, somebody comes and castrates you, how are you going to feel about it? So this thing that the Jamesian allies were doing was wrong. That's one of the problems I say that I have with the Damascus community. And it's well known. It's in Josephus. It's talked about in Hippolytus, Epiphanius. That's hard to say his name, Epiphanius. Anyway, all of those. And of course, Origen misread it and apparently cut off his member. So it was a big deal, okay? It really was. So that's what it was about. Now, getting to the ferocity and the unjust behavior of later Christians who came out of this group of James, that's where they came from, okay? And Paul was trying to reduce their ability to fight against Rome, as I've explained before, and make it a cosmopolitan church to destroy the Jamesian Jesus, the real foundations of what Jesus had set. These people carried over, and there was a lady by the name of Hypatia, one of the most beautiful, intelligent women of the ancient world, and I mentioned her a couple of years back. Hypatia was a mathematician. She was a pagan. She didn't believe in Christianity, which is fine, of course, but the Christians didn't take too kindly to that she would not convert to their way of thinking. Not all of them, of course. Some people, because of course, like I said, James just wanted, if you were going to come into his community, you had to abide by certain rules. But now we're almost 3 centuries down the road, when the just before the library at Alexandria was destroyed, and Hypatia was this beautiful, intelligent woman, a mathematician, took care of the library, and was walking to or from work one day, and she was attacked by a group of Christians who killed her, dismembered her body, and sent her body parts all over the place. Is that the kind of people you want to be associated with? A lot of Christians are like that. Matter of fact, I'm dealing with one quite often who calls himself a Christian on YouTube, who constantly comes on there and says that God's going to come and get me because God will not be mocked, and he doesn't know what being mocked is. And he doesn't understand history, and he doesn't understand Scripture, and he's threatening myself and others because we don't agree with his particular take on things, which is interesting. But anyway, that's what I'm saying. I don't have any use for somebody like that, and that's what these people were like who killed this wonderful woman, Hypatia, who I would have been very fortunate to know if I had the opportunity. I'll tell you. So that tells you, what the Romans were dealing with. And that was right after the Bar Kokhba rebellion and prior to Constantine and Epiphanius, who was Constantine's top bishop and was taking care of the Nicene Council and all that. So that's where this came from. That's where this idea of celibacy and eunuchs came from in the Christian faith, because this morphed into celibacy being a higher state of being, and it's not. I'm not saying you can't choose to do that. You've got your free agency, but you don't have to do it based on some concept, some insistence by some religious leader. You don't have to do it, okay? It was a Roman innovation, a Roman innovation. As I said, Origen misunderstood it. It was actually circumcision that they were talking about, being made eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. Celibacy in the situation like with James, where he became, on his Nazirite vow, a lifetime Nazirite vow. Okay, that's kind of being a eunuch for the kingdom of heaven's sake. So he never married. But again, for the reasons I've already explained, not because he didn't appreciate women or anything like that. Although I will show you a little thing about a word, maybe a little later, a Hebrew word that kind of makes you wonder. But anyway, celibacy is a path for some. Yeah, if they want to do that, that's fine. But that's, as far as the Torah is concerned, as far as the roots of Christianity and the Israelite religion, it's actually a curse. Celibacy is actually a curse. As I've explained, the nunnery in the Catholic Church was taken off the idea of the Vestal Virgins from Rome, and the cloistered nuns especially are following that path. They've made that choice primarily because I'm not saying they're not smart, they couldn't make their own decisions, but more than likely they've been influenced by somebody else because God wants them to be fruitful and multiply. I had a great aunt, by the way, who was a cloistered nun, okay? And we talked about this stuff all the time, but she was like in her 80s when I was in high school, maybe even junior high school, and she wanted me to be a priest. And even then I said, no, no, I'm not going to be a Catholic priest. No, and this is the reason why. All right. So now we're down here. We talked about it was actually circumcision, and it was so that the people who wanted to become part of the kingdom of heaven that Jesus was establishing on the earth, they would be circumcised. And James carried on that particular requirement. Okay. All right, so we're losing time here, so let me get to the next subject. And I know I never take chat. I promise you, I don't like to do chat responses in the morning or take a lot of time because I want you to watch David Knight and the early morning news things because it's important that we keep up on it. But I'm also careful at night because Monty comes on, Monograph, and he always has some very interesting information, and he's very worthwhile to follow. Plus, there are tons of others, High Impact TV. I think one's called Monkey Works or something like that. Grease Monkey, whatever Brian does on those things. So I don't like to interfere with those people because that information is so important to you. So that's the reason why I kind of slip in areas where I think it's going to be okay to take up everybody's time. So anyway, but one night here, sometime, I will have an hour or two where I'll just take questions off of the chat, okay? Throw anything, let's keep it on world events and on the things that I'm talking about with the first century and those related topics. And why again? Because we're there today. Like I said in a video not too long ago, the reason why I'm pressing on these things so hard is because we're in the exact same situation today that they were in the first century. Rome is bearing down, and we have betrayers and traitors in our midst. Trump was one of them who pretended to be a friend, and he was not. And he continues to push for these weapons of destruction, and you know what I'm talking about. Okay, let's talk about the Parousia because I think it might be of interest to you. It means, and it was basically a lot of Christians think it was a Christian development that explains why Christ didn't come in the generation that he said he would. And they call it the delay of the Parousia, or the delay of the coming. And I didn't bring my Bible in here, but if you read Habakkuk in the Bible, chapter 2, verses 3 to 4, it talks about this delay is going to happen, so wait for it. Just be patient and wait for it. So they were anticipating that this thing wouldn't quite go the way Daniel had laid it out, okay? That there would be some kind of change along the way. They didn't know what, but they knew that there would be some kind of change. Well, as you know, as I've been talking about, the people at Qumran, the Messianic movement in the first century, the Zealots, the Sicarii, Jamesian community, all of them knew that the war with Rome was imminent. They knew it was coming. And yet, even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they realized, I mentioned it the other day, that either their Messiah would kill the Romans or the Romans would kill their Messiah. And they weren't sure which way it was going to go. They had both explanations in there. Remember, I've said prophecy has two paths, and I mentioned that the other day. So we can get into the suffering servant of Isaiah 52 and 53 as opposed to the Davidic Messiah who would destroy all of his enemies. So there's something going on there. And I've talked a lot about that, and it's in my book as well. Well, in the Dead Sea Scrolls is a thing called the Habakkuk Pesher. Pesher just means commentary, explanation, that kind of thing. And they had it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And most likely the Habakkuk Pesher, MMT, and some other documents are probably, if not written by the hand of James, at least dictated by him and a scribe writing it down. That's how close to James we are in these things, okay? And he uses exegesis, which is, expanding and taking information and then applying it in different ways. Anyway, he uses that to talk in a lot of Peshers, the Isaiah Pesher, the Daniel Pesher, the Ezekiel Pesher, etc. Most likely, those are things coming from James as he applies the ancient scriptures to their present time in the first century and projecting it forward into the future. So they weren't sure if they were really going to do this. They knew Jerusalem was going to get destroyed. They were pretty sure about that. And they arranged to have the Jamesian community flee Jerusalem. It's called the Pella Flight. And I've mentioned that a couple of times. So they knew it was going to happen and they left. And then there was another group, as I was telling you, that went to Masada. And we'll talk about that in relation to this Parousia here in just a minute. So the Habakkuk Pesher actually talks about there may be this delay, that God may not actually come and save us now. The heavenly host might not actually come. That God's going to delay it for some reason that he knows about and that we can't quite figure out. So the point is, was there ever another coming of Jesus prior to the one that we're looking forward to now? And if you look in my videos that I've been talking about for some time, I do believe that Jesus kept his promise and did come to the people in his generation as he promised he would. I do believe that personally. Where did it happen? Well, part of it was the fleeing of the Jamesian community from the Jerusalem and Qumranian areas into the Pella and then further east. That was part of that. I think that they received instruction to get out. The same way God's angels told Lot to get out of Sodom. Same kind of thing. So I do believe that if Jesus himself didn't come back, there was something else that happened where a messenger told them to leave. That's the first one. The second one, as I've mentioned to you many times, is the situation at Masada. The commander at the fortress of Masada during the war they actually got there probably right after or right before the destruction of Jerusalem. The people that took their posts in Masada were all relatives or very close friends, in my opinion, of Jesus. For instance, the commander was the son of one Judas, Simon the Zealot, which is very likely Judas Iscariot that I've talked about before, the brother of Jesus. He was a Sicarii. That's where the name Iscariot comes from. It means Judas the Iscariot, Judas the Sicarii, really. Judas was a warrior, as I showed in my book. Okay, so this Eliezer was actually a descendant of those Galilean messianic groups that were fighting the Romans. And of course, you know that they fought there at Masada. They kept the Romans at bay for well over a year. And then finally, Titus had a ramp built up to it took them, I think, 6 or 8 months to build this ramp. And they used it to assault Masada. And the story is when they got there, everybody had committed suicide because they would prefer that to becoming slaves. Well, okay, now that could have happened, but I've looked at some archaeological studies on that, and they really can't verify that a mass suicide occurred on Masada. They really can't verify it. And I've explained before that probably what happened was, and I know this is a supernatural part of my personal belief system, but it is based, as I've said, on historical evidence, because I do think that these things can happen. We do see significant events in our lives that really don't make sense. I could tell you one that happened the other day, but I don't want to bore you. So the Romans get up there, and the emperor, is expecting, that we get booty from up there. We get slaves. We're going to kill all the guys and take all the women and children and sell them as slaves, et cetera, right? Well, they get up there, and one of two things happened. Either they got away or they all committed suicide. There's not much evidence for the mass suicide. I think they got away. Did they have a secret tunnel they could get out of? I doubt it, because the Roman legions had surrounded Masada. I don't think they could have gotten out. I think that they're very likely, in my opinion, that their father, their brother, their uncle, their cousin, Jesus came back just like he promised he would and got him out of there. Similar to the situation that had it happened with Enoch. That's my own personal opinion. I can't prove it, but otherwise Jesus lied, because he said there would be people in that generation that would still be there when he returned. But how many returns are there? Well, of course, then there's the Pauline thing that's in the Gospels where it says, if somebody says I'm here or over there or whatever, don't believe them not, because it won't happen until you see Jesus come in the clouds of heaven with the clouds of glory with the hosts of God. Well, that's what I'm saying. He could have done that at Masada. You're not looking for him in a church or out in the desert or whatever. He comes when you're not expecting him. I come as a thief in the night. In other words, you're not going to know when I come. But when I come, I'm going to come in the clouds of heaven. So he could have done that at Masada. Well, the delay of the Parousia. Let me read you something out of the Habakkuk Pesher. I think you'll find this interesting. This is the Habakkuk Pesher, very likely written by James himself or instructed by somebody to write down by James. Listen to this. Well, I'm going to read a commentary on it out of Essene, okay? Out of this book that you all know, okay? But the most obvious dating tool for the Habakkuk Pesher is the citation and exegesis of Habakkuk 2:4, the climax of the Pesher. The righteous shall live by his faith. What do I say all the time? The two most important things: righteousness and piety, right? Righteousness and love of God. Being a zealot, right? And being a pious person that loves God. Okay? The scriptural passage forming the basis of a good deal of Paul's scriptural exegesis, to say nothing of James. See, he says, he's hinting, this sounds an awful lot like James' material, and I'm certain that it is. In addition to this, there is also, as in James 5:7-11, the counseling of patience tied to the exegesis of Habakkuk 2:3. Quote, if it tarries, wait for it, which directly precedes this. Both of these passages are interpreted eschatologically, that is, in the terms of the end time. In fact, the interpretation of Habakkuk 2:3 is specifically related to the delay of this end and resembles nothing as much as the scriptural warrant for what goes in Christianity even today under the heading of the delay of the Parousia. The delay of the second coming of Christ and the final eschatological events associated with this. As the Pesher puts this, the last era, or last end, will be extended and exceed, this is actually almost verbatim from the Pesher. The last era will be extended and exceed all that the prophets, primarily Daniel, had foretold, since the mysteries of God are astounding, unquote. Let me read that again from the Pesher itself. Quote, the last era, or the last end, will be extended and exceed all that the prophets, primarily Daniel, have foretold, since the mysteries of God are astounding, unquote. The exposition, just as with that of Habakkuk 2:4, which follows, then goes on to apply this, like James 1:22-24, to the doers of the Torah. What did I say? When you believe in something, you do it. It's not just a hypothetical emotionalism. You actually are doing it. You become it. When you take the name of Jesus Christ on you, you're taking what he does into you and you do it. What did he say? He said, greater things will you do than I have done because I go to the Father. Greater things will you do than I have done. That's as far as I'll go on that, because then it gets into some Pauline stuff and the arguments between James and Paul, and we don't want to go there today. That'd take too much time. All right, so I thought that would be of some interest to you all. Search these things out for yourself. Again, I encourage you to get Eisenman's books. Look, There are a lot of scholars out there. There are disagreements on the dating of the scrolls. There are disagreements on the Shroud of Turin. There are disagreements on whether James or Peter took over the church, and I've explained my position on that. And I think a lot of scholars, including Eisenman, do believe that James was the leader, not Peter. That the events of the first century and the development of Christianity as we have today is significantly different than you've been told in your churches. By the way, not that there's anything wrong with learning about turning the other cheek, loving your neighbor as yourself, remembering Jesus when you eat or drink, which is really what he was saying. When you do this, do it in remembrance of me, not the Catholic concept that that's really blood, because if it were, that would also go against Jesus' teachings, and James in particular, about the concept of drinking and eating things that would pollute you. So, and of course the temple. So at any rate, eating and drinking in remembrance of those sacrifices is certainly worthwhile and right. All those things are fine. Again, where I'm coming from is a more historical background as to what really happened, because so many little things have been put in for the last 2,000 years to make you a pacifist, who make you submit to authority. And we're not supposed to do that. We're not supposed to do that. If we do, then there is no concept of liberty. There is no concept of free will. God doesn't expect you to follow evil. He expects you to stand in righteousness, even if you're the only person in the whole world to do it, which was exactly what James did. He may not have been 100% right on what he thought, but he did the righteous thing and stood against evil and the unrighteousness of his time. Okay, I got to go. There are other things happening. Feel free to look at this stuff. We'll talk a little bit more later. Don't get so upset the way things are going that you feel like you got to stop. You know, a lot of times I feel, why am I doing this anymore? I mean, I have no control over this. There are people out there that most people aren't, you know, they don't pay any attention to any of this. But we have a responsibility, in my mind, that we still stand on the watchtower and warn others. It's not a matter of pride. It's not a matter of, gee, I want my face on YouTube or my written word on Twitter. It's that we need to be watchmen on the watchtowers, and we need to be shouting from the housetops about what's going on. Not in a prideful way, like we know something that nobody else does, but in a warning way, because we're told, if you know, if you understand, you are to warn your neighbor. Okay? And we need to call out the evil for what it is. And I'm going to be calling out the evil against Trump, Biden, and all these people for a long time. I don't know who, you know, Rand Paul has pulled out some good information, made it public, but it's been out for a while. There is nobody in our government, I don't think, who will go after these criminals that have pushed this medical tyranny upon us. I don't think that there's anybody in there. There might be portions or parts of organizations like the DoD, certainly some of the states, maybe, but this is going to be a massive war in any way, shape, or form, and they'll have a massive war with China or Russia to keep us from reclaiming our rights, the actual conduct of our liberty. They don't care about that. They care about their power, even if they kill everything on the planet. I'm still amazed about this CO2 thing. You remember Gates was up there and he had that equation, you know, CO2, and they had people and cars and, you know, all that stuff. And he says, well, at least one of these has to go to zero. He's supposed to be a scientist and he doesn't know that CO2 is part of the life cycle. It's one of the 4 necessary things. You got to have CO2, oxygen, water, and sunlight. And he wants to get rid of one of those. What's wrong with him? And the world's following this maniac? Well, he's being found out more and more, but he's got a lot of powerful people, including our government, supporting him. Well, the real end, of course, is they want to put an end to mankind. That's what they're really about, because they are demons in the flesh. That's really what they are. All right. Yeah, he wants to get rid of sunlight too. Good point, Mr. Cox. Well, that's my point. You know, the guys. It's like I said before. The industrial giants raped the earth. Admittedly gave us things in the meantime. For instance, fuel, cars, etc. They're the ones that started down this path, and now they want to blame you for the problems that they caused. Really pretty good Hegelian dialectic, isn't it? There are other ways to solve these problems without interfering with nature, without killing off the multitudes of mankind, and changing the very basic genetics, DNA of every living thing on earth. No, they want to be God. They want to make this, as I talked about some time ago, a new heaven and a new earth in their image, rather than in the image that God wanted it to be in, because they consider themselves God. Ray Kurzweil said that. I'll be the first. I don't believe in God. I'm going to be the first God. Eric Schmidt is like that. Gates is like that. Prince Charles is like that, etc., etc. No sound? Okay, well, too bad. I can't do anything about it now. I'm out of here. We'll see you all later. We'll have a nighttime some point where we can all sit down and have a real chat, okay? All right, take care.